Imagine living under the rule of a brutal empire, where oppression and injustice were unwritten laws. The Assyrian Empire reigned with an iron fist, conquering nations, enslaving people and spreading terror wherever it went. Its armies were feared, its walls impenetrable, and its capital, Nineveh, seemed untouchable. Who would dare predict his ruin? The answer came from a man few knew, Nahum, a prophet who emerged from anonymity to proclaim a shocking message. He announced what seemed impossible, the complete destruction of Nineveh. His words were not just empty warnings, they were vivid visions, revealed directly by God. Nahum not only described the fall of the city, but detailed how and why it would happen. But did anyone believe it? The people mocked, the rulers ignored, and the powerful laughed at the idea that their empire could fall. After all, Nineveh was the jewel of the ancient world, surrounded by colossal walls and protected by mighty rivers. How could a simple prophet be right against the overwhelming strength of Assyria? What no one knew was that Nahum's prophecy would be fulfilled in an exact and devastating way. The empire, which seemed unshakable, would collapse in a surprising turn of history. Its destruction was not a simple chance, but an act of divine justice, a response to the cry of oppressed peoples, and a reminder that no earthly power lasts forever. In this video, we dive into this stunning prophecy and discover how one man, armed only with words and faith, challenged one of the most feared empires in the world. Get ready to learn the details of this real, impactful, and twisting story, which teaches us a powerful lesson about justice, faith, and the destiny of great nations. Since ancient times, humanity has witnessed the collapse of empires that seemed eternal. But few events were as impactful as the fall of Nineveh. The capital of the Assyrian Empire was a symbol of power and invincibility. However, the prophet Nahum assured that no kingdom can challenge God's justice without suffering the consequences. His words were not just a prophecy, but a sentence announced against a city that had abused its power for centuries. Nineveh did not fall by chance. His downfall was the result of divine judgment, a reckoning with an empire that oppressed nations, spread terror, and ignored any notion of mercy. Nahum proclaimed that the corruption of rulers and cruelty against conquered peoples had reached the limit. God's patience had come to an end, and the city that once seemed untouchable was about to be crushed by forces beyond human comprehension. Many doubted the prophecy. How could such a well-fortified city be overthrown? But Nahum's words were clear. Nineveh's walls would crumble, its rivers would turn against it, and its greatness would turn to ruins. He wasn't talking about just any punishment, but about total destruction, a turnaround that would leave the entire world in shock. God does not forget injustices, and when the time is right, he acts with power and precision. The story of the fall of Nineveh teaches us something fundamental. No empire, no matter how grand it may seem, can escape divine justice. The arrogance of the Assyrian rulers made them believe they were invincible, but they ignored an essential principle: God rules above any human king. When a people sinks into corruption and cruelty, sooner or later their own greatness becomes their undoing. And so, what seemed impossible began to unfold. But how did Nahum receive this message? How did he know so clearly about the end of Nineveh? The answer lies in the visions that God revealed to him. The Assyrian Empire was not just a military power, it was a relentless war machine. His armies advanced like storms over the nations, leaving a trail of destruction and terror. No kingdom felt safe in the face of the overwhelming power of Assyria. Rulers were forced to bow, cities were burned, and entire populations were deported as slaves. Fear of Assyria dominated the ancient world, and for many, resistance was futile. The Assyrians didn't just win battles, they made a point of turning their enemies into living examples of their cruelty. Mass arrests, brutal executions, and torture were common practices. The inscriptions left by their kings do not hide this pride. The defeated were dismembered, impaled, or dragged away in chains like trophies. Oppression was not a mistake in the system, it was the basis of its government. The message was clear: defying Assyria meant signing one's own death warrant. The Israelites felt the weight of this tyranny. The northern kingdom, Israel, was brutally destroyed by the Assyrians, and its population was exiled to foreign lands. The pain of this exile echoed among the survivors, and Nahum's promise that Nineveh would fall was their only hope for justice. After all, how could a just God allow such a bloodthirsty empire to prosper forever? The oppressed nations longed for revenge, but was it really possible for Assyria to face its own ruin? The Assyrians' confidence in their own power was unshakable. They believed that their capital, Nineveh, was impenetrable. Surrounded by gigantic walls and protected by the Tigris River, the city was an impossible fortress to conquer. His army, one of the most organized at the time, crushed revolts before they even started. Who would dare challenge the supreme power in the world? The answer would come from where no one expected it. In the midst of this scenario, an unknown man appears, proclaiming a truth that few dared to believe. Nahum had visions that would change everything. What he saw was so shocking that it would change history forever. Not all messages from God arrive in a common way. Some come as sweeping visions, images so powerful they seem more real than reality itself. This is how Nahum received his mission. Amid vivid dreams and divine revelations, he saw something that no one dared to imagine: the great Nineveh reduced to ashes. What seemed impossible was about to happen, and God chose Nahum to be the messenger of this shocking truth. The visions were clear. He saw the city walls crumbling, the army fleeing in despair, and the waters of the Tigris River invading the streets like an unstoppable monster. The capital of the Assyrian Empire, once unbeatable, was now plunged into chaos. But Nahum didn't just see the destruction, he understood the reason behind it. Nineveh was not falling just because of human forces, but because God had decreed the end of its impiety. For many, these images seemed exaggerated, almost impossible. How could a simple prophet be sure of something so great? But time would prove that every detail of his visions was real. The enemy army would actually invade the city. The waters would actually help seal his fate. Assyria would truly become just a memory. Nahum was not talking about a distant, uncertain future. He was describing an inevitable catastrophe. The impact of these visions was profound. Those who believed in God began to feel hope. The oppressed, who lived for years under the Assyrian yoke, saw there a sign of liberation. If Nineveh, with all its strength and arrogance, could fall, then perhaps evil was not so invincible after all. Divine justice was not just an abstract concept. It was something that was about to be fulfilled before everyone's eyes. But having a vision and proclaiming it to the world were very different things. Nahum knew his message would not be well received. Still, he didn't hesitate. He was ready to announce what God had revealed to him, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's call had begun. Nahum was not a king, nor was he a great military leader. He had no armies at his side, nor riches to influence the powerful. But he had something that was worth more than any army: a direct message from God. His call did not come at a time of tranquility, but rather when the world seemed gripped by fear. The Assyrian Empire was absolute, and anyone who dared to oppose it was crushed without mercy. Even so, Nahum did not hesitate to proclaim the destruction of Nineveh. Imagine the difficulty of your mission. Announcing the fall of a city that seemed indestructible sounded crazy. Who would listen to your words? Who would believe your message? But Nahum did not speak for himself. He was chosen to be a messenger of divine justice, and his voice would echo louder than any Assyrian wall. He knew he wasn't alone. God was on his side, and that was all that mattered. Nahum's courage is reminiscent of other prophets who faced immense challenges. Just as Moses confronted Pharaoh and Elijah challenged the false prophets, Nahum rose up against an entire empire. He did not trade in fear, nor did he soften his message to please his listeners. His call was clear: Nineveh will fall, and its destruction will be complete. Anyone who doubted it would soon see it with their own eyes. Most impressively, Nahum didn't just announce the fall of Nineveh, he detailed how it would happen. He predicted that the city would be invaded, plundered, and drowned by its own waters. His every word was a reminder that God does not ignore oppression, nor does he leave corrupt rulers unpunished. Judgment was decreed, and nothing could prevent its fulfillment. But did anyone really believe it? Many chose to ignore or mock his words. After all, Nineveh was still standing grand and powerful. To them, Nahum's prophecy was just empty speech. But time would prove that the prophet was right, and that the Assyrian Empire was not as unshakable as he imagined. However, before the prophecy was fulfilled, the people's skepticism still needed to be addressed. When Nahum announced that Nineveh would be destroyed, the immediate reaction was disbelief. How could such a powerful empire simply fall? To many, his words seemed like the ravings of a man desperate for justice. The city was a true fortress, with walls that reached 30 meters high and armies that defeated any enemy. The idea that all of this could fall apart was ridiculous, to say the least. The people had become accustomed to seeing Assyria win. They saw kingdoms fall, kings bow, and entire cities wiped off the map. If not even the greatest empires could resist, who would dare challenge Nineveh? Even those who hated the Assyrians had difficulty believing that the city could be taken. The arrogance of the Assyrian Empire was so great that many began to think that it really was invincible. But Nahum did not back down. He knew that divine justice does not depend on human logic. History had already shown that no empire lasts forever. Babylon, Egypt, Rome, all the kingdoms that rose on the basis of oppression ended up falling. Why would Nineveh be any different? He continued to proclaim the imminent fall of the city, even though he was disbelieved by many. His role was not to convince, it was to announce what God had already decided. Time passed, and the first signs began to appear. Assyria's enemies were growing stronger, dissatisfaction within the empire was growing, and walls that seemed insurmountable began to show cracks invisible to the naked eye. What seemed impossible began to become a real threat. Nahum's prophecy was getting closer and closer to being fulfilled. But the fall of Nineveh would not come through human force alone. An unexpected and devastating factor would help seal their fate. The forces of nature would step in to deal the final blow to the Assyrian Empire. When we talk about the fall of a great empire, we usually think of wars, betrayals, and invasions. But in the case of Nineveh, an unexpected element played a decisive role. Nature itself turned against the city. Nahum predicted that the Tigris River, which previously served as a natural defense for the Assyrian capital, would be one of the instruments of its destruction. And surprisingly, that's exactly what happened. During the siege of the city, the Babylonians and Medes were already putting pressure on the Assyrians, but there was still a gigantic obstacle: the colossal walls of Nineveh. They were so imposing and well-structured that taking them down seemed impossible. But then, torrential rains began to fall, and the Tigris River burst its banks with overwhelming force. The waters, which previously protected the city, were now its worst enemy. The foundations of the walls gave way, and large sections collapsed, opening the way for the invaders. It was an unexpected blow. Nineveh's enemies did not need to fight against insurmountable walls, because the city itself surrendered to them. With the defenses compromised, the soldiers of Babylon and Media entered like an avalanche, devastating everything in their path. What seemed unthinkable was happening before the eyes of the Assyrians themselves. The city, which was a symbol of power and oppression, was now at the mercy of its enemies. Chaos took over Nineveh. What remained of the Assyrian army tried to resist, but it was too late. The rulers, who had previously laughed at Nahum's prophecies, now ran in despair, not knowing where to flee. While the city was sacked and burned, the rivers continued to overflow, taking with them the last hopes of the empire. The scenario was one of total destruction, exactly as Nahum had announced. The end of Nineveh was swift and merciless. What was once the capital of the greatest empire on earth was now nothing more than rubble. But this was not just a military victory. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy, a reminder that no power lasts forever and that divine justice always finds its way. But the destruction didn't stop there. What happened to the city after the attack? What was left of the Assyrian Empire? In the next part, we will see how the end of Nineveh marked the end of an era. What happens when an empire that seemed indestructible simply disappears? In the case of Assyria, the collapse was brutal and definitive. Nineveh, once one of the most feared cities in the world, turned into a heap of ruins, looted and burned mercilessly. The Assyrian enemies themselves didn't just want to win the war. They wanted to erase Assyria from history. Reports from the time described the complete collapse of the city. Palaces were burned, temples were destroyed, and the royal treasury was looted. The Assyrians who survived had nowhere to flee. Its king, desperate and with no way out, preferred to hide amid the flames of his own palace rather than be captured by his enemies. What was once a symbol of greatness was now just ashes and silence. The fate of Nineveh served as a harsh lesson for the ancient world. For centuries, Assyria reigned cruelly, destroying nations and spreading terror. But in the end, it was she who was annihilated with no chance of recovery. His name, once synonymous with fear, became just a distant memory. Even its location was lost for centuries, until modern archaeologists rediscovered its ruins, buried by time. The impact of this event was not restricted to that period. The destruction of Nineveh marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new rule in the ancient world. With the fall of the Assyrians, Babylon and the Medes took control, beginning a new phase of history. But above all, this was definitive proof that Nahum's prophecy was fulfilled exactly as he announced. Nineveh, the city that thought itself invincible, did not resist divine judgment. But why does this story still matter today? What can we learn from the fall of this empire? The answer lies in what it teaches us about the destiny of great powers and how justice, even when it seems distant, is always fulfilled at the right time. The fall of Nineveh was not just an event of the past. It was a warning to all nations and empires that believe themselves to be above justice. No matter how strong a kingdom seems, pride and oppression always lead to ruin. Assyria ruled cruelly, believing that its strength would make it untouchable, but its destruction showed that no earthly power is eternal. This story reminds us that corruption, arrogance, and injustice always have a price. Assyria fell not only because of enemy armies, but because its own actions condemned it. His empire was built on blood, terror, and exploitation, and in the end he reaped exactly what he sowed. What seemed impossible happened. The oppressed saw their oppressor annihilated. But what does this mean for us today? Nahum's prophecy is not just a historical account, but a message that spans the centuries. How many times do we see leaders and nations acting with the same arrogance, believing that they will never be shaken? How many times does injustice seem to win? The fall of Nineveh teaches us that justice may take time, but it always arrives. Furthermore, this story gives us a reason to hope. If even an empire like Assyria fell to divine judgment, it means that evil never triumphs forever. No human force can prevent what God has determined. Patience may seem long, but reckoning always comes, and when it comes, it is final. In the end, Nineveh disappeared, but the lesson it left behind remains. History may repeat itself, but those who learn from it are always one step ahead. Now the big question is the modern world heeding this warning? The story of Nineveh is not just an account of the past, it is a mirror for today. How many nations, empires, and leaders have fallen for exactly the same reason? Pride blinds, power corrupts, and those who ignore justice end up facing their own destruction. What happened to Nineveh is a stark reminder that no empire, however strong it may seem, can defy the truth without paying the price. But this story also brings hope. If God was able to hear the cry of the oppressed then, He continues to hear it today. If justice was served against such a cruel empire, it means that evil never has the last word. The question is not if justice will come, but when. And when it comes, it will be inescapable, just as it was for Nineveh. And you? What does this story awaken in you? Can we learn from past mistakes, or are we destined to repeat them? The signs of history are everywhere, but it is up to us to see them. Nahum's prophecy teaches us that true power is not in military strength, wealth, or walls, but in righteousness and truth. If this story made you reflect, don't stop here. Knowledge transforms, and understanding the lessons of the Bible helps us see the world with different eyes. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow more content about the prophecies and secrets of biblical history. There is still much more to be revealed.